When I moved into the house on Pinewood Lane, I wasn't looking for anything special. I just needed somewhere quiet, somewhere new, a place to forget everything I left behind in the city. The listing said it was a two-bedroom cottage on the edge of a sleepy town, surrounded by thick woods and barely any neighbors. The price was almost too good to be true. It always is, isn't it? From the moment I stepped inside, something didn't sit right. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something else I couldn't place, like dried flowers and damp earth. The walls felt too close, even though the space wasn't small. It was like the house was leaning in, watching me, waiting. But I brushed it off. I told myself it was just nerves, the weight of change pressing down on me. On my first night, I woke up to someone whispering my name. It wasn't loud. It was soft, like a breath, but it was close. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. Silence. Just the creaking of the old floorboards and the wind pressing against the windows. I convinced myself it was a dream, nothing more, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it, deadbolt and all. But again, I dismissed it. Maybe I forgot. Maybe the latch didn't catch. The mind makes excuses, especially when it's scared. But that night, it happened again. My name, whispered right into my ear this time, so close it felt like someone was beside me in bed. I bolted upright, turned on every light in the house, checked every room, every corner. Nothing. I should have left. I know that now. As days passed, strange things began to happen. I'd wake up to find the chairs in the kitchen slightly moved, my shoes arranged neatly by the door, even though I remembered leaving them by the bed. I once came home from the store and found a steaming mug of tea on the counter. I live alone. There were moments where I'd swear I heard footsteps behind me, slow, dragging steps that stopped the second I turned around. The hallway light flickered constantly, and no matter how many times I changed the bulb, it never stayed on for more than a few hours. One evening, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, smiling at me, even though I wasn't. I stopped sleeping. My body ached from tension, my eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear whispers, soft murmurs, fragmented phrases. Most of it didn't make sense, but sometimes I caught words clearly. Stay. Don't leave. You're home now. I started hearing my name in places it didn't belong, in the rustling leaves outside, in the static of the radio, in the sound of running water. I called my sister, desperate to talk to someone, but the moment she answered, her voice crackled and distorted. All I could hear was a whisper, my name again and again, before the call cut out. I tried to leave. I packed my bags, drove down the road, but after 15 minutes of driving, I somehow ended up back in my own driveway. I tried again. I took different turns, followed GPS, even turned off the car, and walked for hours into the woods. But no matter how far I went, I found myself back at the house that knew me. It knew what I feared. It knew what I missed. It began mimicking voices, my mother's laughter, my ex's soothing tone, even the bark of my childhood dog. It would play them late at night, just beyond the walls. I knew it wasn't real, but I'd find myself standing outside my room at 3 a.m., reaching for a door that wasn't there. One night, I found something carved into the wooden floor beneath the hallway rug. My full name, first, middle, and last, etched in neat, straight lines. Underneath it, a date, not the day I moved in, a future date, 2 weeks ahead. I tried burning the house down. I poured gasoline through the rooms, struck a match, and watched the flames roar. But they didn't spread. The fire sputtered and died on its own, as if swallowed by the walls. That night, the house was quiet, too quiet. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, the house had rearranged itself. The kitchen door now opened to a dark staircase I'd never seen before. The bathroom mirror reflected a version of me with hollow eyes and a faint smile that didn't belong to me. The whispers grew louder, clearer. I could almost see their mouths now, small shadows flickering just out of sight, lips moving just inches behind my ear. The date carved into the floor arrived. That night, I was dragged from my bed, not by hands, not by force I could fight, just by cold air, invisible pressure, a pull that paralyzed. I was taken to the basement, a place I hadn't dared go until then. The door opened on its own. The stairs were lined with candles. At the bottom, there was a chair, old, wooden, familiar, because I'd dreamed of it before. I sat down. I didn't want to. I tried to resist, but my body moved on its own. A voice, one I didn't recognize, spoke behind me. It welcomed me home. It thanked me for staying. It said I'd been chosen, just like the others. I saw their faces, reflections in the candlelight, shadows pressed into the walls. I wasn't the first. I won't be the last. I've forgotten what the outside world looks like. I try to write, to remember, to tell someone what happened. But every time I finish a sentence, The ink faded. My voice doesn't carry beyond the front porch. Even now, I hear footsteps upstairs. Though I haven't gone up in days, I think it's me. Another version of the house knows my name. It always did, and now it's learning yours. When I first bought the house, I studied every inch of the floor plan. I'd obsessed over the layout for weeks, memorizing every room, every hallway, every tiny measurement. It was supposed to be a fresh start for me and my wife, a clean break after the loss of our daughter. We thought moving to a quiet countryside property would help us breathe again, heal. The house was old but solid, tucked away behind rows of evergreens, its worn bricks and ivy-covered walls, giving it an eerie kind of charm. Something about it felt ancient, like it had always been waiting for someone to come back. We moved in during late autumn. The leaves had just begun to fall, and the wind carried a constant whisper through the trees. Everything was colder than expected, inside and out, but I blamed the age of the place. The heating worked fine, but the chill never left the walls, as though the house itself was holding on to something it couldn't let go of. A few days after we settled in, I found a door that wasn't supposed to be there. It was in the upstairs hallway, tucked between the linen closet and the guest room. I stood in front of it for a long time, confused. It wasn't on any of the floor plans I'd studied. I remember checking and double-checking everything before buying. There was no mention of an extra room, no visible space that would allow for it. But there it was, an old wooden door with a tarnished brass handle and peeling white paint. I called my wife to look at it. She tilted her head and gave me a confused look. "What door?" she asked. I thought she was joking at first. I gestured toward it, put my hand on the knob, even tried to open it. It didn't budge, locked, but her expression never changed, just blank confusion, like she genuinely couldn't see what I was pointing at. She turned and walked away, leaving me staring at a door that only I could see. I didn't mention it again. Maybe I was tired. Maybe grief was playing tricks on me. That night, I dreamed of the door, saw it slowly creak open from the inside, revealing a long, narrow room bathed in pale blue light. In the dream, I walked inside, and the door shut behind me. I woke up cold and drenched in sweat. My bedroom door was open. I always kept it closed. The next morning, the door in the hallway was still there, still locked, still unnoticed by my wife. I pressed my ear against it, half expecting silence. Instead, I heard something faint, like scratching. It was soft at first, like a small animal trapped inside. But when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't claws. It was fingernails. I brought it up to my wife again, this time showing her the exact spot. But she just stared at the blank stretch of wall and shook her head. I could see it plain as day, but to her there was nothing there. She started worrying about me after that, suggesting I rest, talk to someone, take a break. I didn't blame her, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. The scratching grew louder each. I started hearing whispers from behind the door, low and distorted, like a voice underwater. Some nights I could make out words. Other times it was just murmurs, layered voices overlapping each, calling out to be let in or let out. I tried ignoring it, but every night I dreamed of the room again, and each time I stepped further into it. The walls were bare, gray, and damp. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and something sour, and in the corner of the room there was always a shape, small at first, unmoving, but it grew clearer with each dream. A child, a girl, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, her head buried in her arms. It was my daughter. I hadn't seen her face since the accident, but I knew that silhouette anywhere. The dreams became unbearable. Every night she would lift her head slowly, revealing a pale, hollow-eyed version of her face, twisted as if caught between sorrow and rage. She'd whisper things I couldn't understand. Sometimes she screamed, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake up until the door behind me slammed shut. I became obsessed with the real door. I tried everything, keys, hammers, even prying the handle off, but it never opened. It didn't even dent. The wood felt soft and damp to the touch, almost like flesh. I started hallucinating during the day, seeing glimpses of that room reflected in windows, in mirrors, in puddles of water, and always, that figure sitting silently in the corner. One evening, I came home to find the door wide open. It hadn't been that way when I left. The hallway was darker than usual, and cold air rushed out from the room beyond. My wife was nowhere in sight. I stepped inside cautiously. The walls were the same as the ones in my dream, damp, moldy, suffocating. The room was longer than it should have been, impossibly long, like it stretched into something older, deeper than the house itself. In the far corner, she was there, my daughter, or whatever wore her shape. She looked up at me and whispered, "You left me." I backed away, stumbling over my feet, but the door behind me had vanished. I was trapped. The air grew colder, thicker, until it felt like I was breathing through ice. Shadows moved along the walls, flickering and crawling like insects. And then I heard voices, hundreds of them, all whispering from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Some laughed, some cried. All of them knew my name. I don't remember how I got out. I woke up in my bed, door closed, wife asleep beside me, but I know I was in that room. I still feel the dampness in my bones. I still hear the voices at night. The door is gone now, vanished completely. Not even I can see it anymore. But sometimes in the early hours of the morning, I hear knocking from behind the wall where it once stood. Not scratching, knocking. Soft, rhythmic knocks, like a child trying to come home. And I know one day it'll open again. Not for me, but for someone else. The first thing I noticed about the house was how the hallway upstairs didn't seem quite right. It was just a bit longer than it should have been, but at the time, I thought I was imagining it. When you move into a new place, everything feels off at first. New smells, new sounds, unfamiliar shadows. My wife and I chalked it up to the old architecture and strange layout. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that hallway. We had moved into the house after months of searching for something peaceful, away from the noise of the city. A place to raise our soon-to-be-born child. The realtor mentioned the house had been vacant for years, but there was no mention of anything unusual. No rumors, no history. Just a quiet home nestled at the edge of a wooded area, with creaky stairs and old wallpaper peeling at the corners. It was exactly what we thought we needed. That hallway, though, it kept bothering me. The first few nights, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, swear it looked longer than it had before. The distance from the bedroom to the bathroom seemed to stretch just a little farther each time. I even started counting my steps. The first night, 12. A few nights later, 16. Then 20. I didn't say anything to my wife. She was already stressed from the pregnancy, and I didn't want to spook her over something I couldn't explain. One night, I had to get up to check on a strange noise, something like faint footsteps echoing through the house. I stepped out of the bedroom, and that's when I saw it clearly. The hallway was longer, much longer. The end of it seemed to vanish into shadows that hadn't been there before. The wallpaper was different, too. Older, faded, with strange floral patterns I didn't recognize. And there was a door at the end. A door that wasn't there before. It looked ancient, not just old, but impossibly worn, like it had been there for decades longer than the rest of the house. I started walking toward it, my feet heavy with dread. The floorboards groaned louder with each step, and the hallway seemed to stretch even further, like it was pulling away from me, refusing to let me reach the door. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the hallway snapped back to normal. 12 steps, bathroom door, familiar wallpaper. I froze, staring at the space where the other door had been. Nothing. Just the same hallway I'd walked 100 times already. I told myself it was stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even a bad dream while half awake. But I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the chill of that other hallway on my skin. It kept happening. Each night, the hallway would change. Longer, darker, colder. Sometimes there were whispers, soft voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Other times, I'd see movement at the end. A flicker of something humanoid, always just out of view. And always that door, just barely visible before everything snapped back again. I tried telling my wife, but she thought I was having some kind of breakdown. She suggested I see a therapist. I didn't blame her. I was beginning to question my own sanity. But then something changed. She saw it too. One night she screamed from the bathroom. I ran in and she was curled in a corner, shaking. She said she'd stepped out of the room, and the hallway just kept going, stretching longer and longer until the lights began to flicker, and she couldn't find her way back. She said there were voices. Something touched her shoulder. When she turned around, there was nothing there, but she felt it. Cold, bony fingers. After that, things got worse. The hallway no longer waited for night. Sometimes in the middle of the day, we'd look up from whatever we were doing and notice it was too long again. Lights would flicker. The floor would creak with footsteps that didn't belong to us. The door at the end became more permanent, less of an illusion, more real. We tried to avoid it. We stopped using the upstairs altogether. We even slept in the living room, but it didn't help. The hallway began bleeding into the rest of the house, shadows that didn't belong, doors that led to nowhere, furniture rearranged while we slept, a deep, oppressive silence that filled the rooms during the night, like the house itself was listening. And then came the knocking, always from that door. Slow, deliberate knocks, 3 at a time. Then, silent. We never opened it. We couldn't. It was locked from the other side. But one night the knocking changed, became frantic, desperate, like something on the other side needed out, or needed in. We packed our bags that night. My wife was crying. She didn't care about selling the place or losing money. She just wanted to. I did too. I felt like we were being watched every second we stayed. But as we were carrying our last bag downstairs, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice from upstairs, small, fragile, like a child. Daddy, don't leave me. I froze on the stairs. My wife looked up at me, eyes wide with terror. She heard it too. We ran. We never went back for the rest of our things. We left furniture, clothes, everything. I don't even know if the house still stands. I don't care. But sometimes, late at night, I see a hallway in my dreams, longer than it should be, and at the end of it, a door slowly creaks open, and I know if I ever step through it, I won't come back. We moved into the house on Birchwood Lane because it was the only place we could afford after my husband lost his job. It was small, old, and needed work, but it had a charm to it. A quaint little two-bedroom cottage nestled between empty lots, far enough from town that the nights were quiet, sometimes too quiet. The place had been unoccupied for years, but it didn't look neglected. In fact, it almost looked like someone had just left it. Furniture was still covered in white sheets, dishes still in the cabinets, and a faint smell of lavender in the air. The first few nights were peaceful. My daughter, Emma, loved the big backyard. My husband busied himself fixing leaky pipes and repainting the walls. But one night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft thud from the kitchen. I figured it was just the old house settling. When I went to check, the back door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch a breeze. I was sure I had locked it earlier. I shut it, turned the bolt, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. They weren't ours. They were small, almost like a child's, but distorted somehow, elongated with too many toes, and they led nowhere. Just a few steps across the floor, then nothing. We tried to explain it away. Maybe an animal somehow got in, but we couldn't stop thinking about how human they looked. After that, strange things began to happen. Emma started talking to someone in her room. When I asked her who it was, she'd say, "The boy in the wall." At first, we laughed it off. Imaginary friends aren't uncommon, especially with only one child and no neighbors around. But she started drawing pictures, crude, scratchy sketches of a pale, lanky boy with hollow eyes and long, crooked fingers, always peeking out of a wall or from behind a door. One drawing showed him sitting at the foot of her bed. I started hearing things, soft scratching sounds at night, like nails dragging across wood. My husband thought it was mice, so we set traps. None were ever triggered. Then, the walls began to creak and groan, even without wind. It sounded like footsteps in the walls, pacing back and forth through the night. One night, I woke to Emma screaming. We rushed to her room, and she was huddled in a corner, crying, her eyes fixed on the wall beside her bed. She said the boy had climbed out and tried to touch her face. She said he was cold, and he whispered something she didn't understand. That same night, we noticed the wallpaper peeling near the spot she pointed to. Beneath it, etched into the plaster, were scratches, dozens of tiny marks like fingernails, scraping again and again. My husband tried to stay rational, but the more we tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Emma refused to sleep in her room, and we started noticing shadows moving through the house at odd angles, always just out of view. Mirrors would fog up with handprints when no one had touched them. My husband found one on the bathroom mirror one. 5 fingers pressed so hard, the glass was slightly cracked at the edges. It was higher than where any of us could have reached. Then came the night we decided to leave. It started like any other, a quiet dinner, some TV, Emma falling asleep on the couch. But the moment we tried to put her in her bed, the entire house seemed to change. The lights dimmed, even though we hadn't touched them. The air grew thick, heavy. We heard movement behind the walls, faster this time, more frantic. The scratching turned to banging. Something was inside the walls, trying to get out. We grabbed Emma and ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't open. It wasn't stuck. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. My husband tried the back door, but the same thing. Every window refused to budge. The house was sealing us in. That's when we heard it, the boy's voice. Whispers from every corner of the room, overlapping, distorted, saying something in a language that made my skin crawl. Emma screamed, and I turned just in time to see a hand, thin, grayish, with long fingers, reaching out of the wall near her room. It curled around the doorframe, pulling itself forward. And then, the boy stepped through the wall, as if the plaster were water. He didn't walk. He glided. His eyes weren't just hollow, they were bottomless. No light reflected off them, just void. He looked at Emma, reached toward her, and whispered something I'll never forget. She belongs here now. I don't remember how we got out. One moment we were screaming, running, the next the front door flew open like it had never been locked. We didn't take anything. We left everything behind, even Emma's toys, even my husband's tools. We didn't care, we just wanted to get away. We moved back in with my sister temporarily, and Emma hasn't spoken much since. She won't draw. She won't sleep alone, but sometimes I find her staring at the wall for long periods, eyes fixed, unblinking. When I ask her what she's looking at, she just whispers, "He's still watching." And sometimes I think she's right. I've never been someone who believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, cursed objects, they were all just fiction to me. But that changed when I moved into the small two-bedroom house on Maple Hill. I'd been through a rough breakup, and I wanted to start fresh. New city, new job, new place to call home. The house was affordable, cozy, and tucked away at the end of a quiet street surrounded by trees. I signed the lease without thinking twice. The first few days were normal. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and tried to settle into my new routine. But from the very beginning, there was something off about the bedroom. It wasn't anything I could explain logically, just this heavy feeling, like the air was thicker in there, like the walls were holding their breath. At night, even with the door shut, I could hear faint creaks and thuds from inside that room. I figured it was just the house settling. Old floorboards, loose nails, nothing serious. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. Faint, low murmurs, like someone was speaking in the next room. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, thinking maybe someone had broken in. But when I reached the bedroom door, the sound stopped completely. I opened it slowly, but the room was empty, just the same boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. I told myself it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But over the next few nights, the whispers got louder. They weren't words I could understand, just gibberish, like a language that didn't belong to this world. Sometimes they came from the corners of the room, sometimes from underneath the bed. I started sleeping on the couch just to avoid that place. But even then, the noises followed me. I'd hear light tapping on the walls, soft scratching from inside the closet, and once, I swear I heard my own name spoken in a voice that didn't sound human. Things got worse when I finally decided to clean out the bedroom closet. I hadn't touched it since moving in. It was deep and strangely narrow, with a slanted ceiling and an old wooden shelf nailed to the back wall. As I moved a few boxes, I noticed something odd. The wallpaper inside the closet didn't match the rest of the house. It was older, cracked, and beneath it were strange black symbols, drawn directly onto the wall. Symbols I'd never seen before. I didn't know if they were part of some old renovation or something else, but the moment I touched them, I felt a wave of nausea crash over me. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispers turned into groans, long, guttural sounds that echoed through the walls. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that vanished when I turned my head. The worst part was the mirror in the hallway. It began showing things that weren't there, figures standing behind me that disappeared when I turned around. Once, I caught a glimpse of a tall, faceless person standing in the bedroom doorway. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I finally called the landlord and asked about the house's history. At first, he hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he told me that a previous tenant had died in the bedroom closet, a young man who'd lived alone, who had slowly lost his grip on reality. He kept telling people that something in the house was whispering to him, showing him. He ended his life inside that closet. They found him days later, his fingers scraped raw from clawing at the walls. I moved out the next morning. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing the deposit. I just needed to get away. But ever since I left, I still hear the whispers. Not every night, but enough to know they've followed me. And when I close my eyes in the dark, I see that faceless figure again, standing just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for me to come back. Sometimes, I wonder if I ever really left that house at all. I didn't want to move back to my hometown, but after my mom passed away, her house was left to me. It had stood vacant for a few years, sitting at the edge of a decaying cul-de-sac, surrounded by overgrown trees and silence. I didn't have the money to sell it or fix it up right away, so I moved in temporarily, just until I figured out my next step. That's what I told myself. But from the moment I stepped through the front door, I felt like I wasn't alone. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. There weren't sudden slams or cold drafts. It was subtle, too subtle, the kind of quiet that makes you paranoid. The first thing I noticed was how the lights flickered only in one room, my old bedroom. Every time I turned them on, they would flicker faintly, like the bulb was about to burn out. I replaced it multiple times, but it never stopped. Then came the dreams. At first, I thought they were just the result of stress or memories resurfacing, but they were too vivid, too real. I kept dreaming of that room, only it wasn't quite the same. The wallpaper was different, the furniture was rearranged, and there was always someone else in the corner, watching me, their face hidden in shadow. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, but somehow, the fear would cling to me for hours after. One morning, I found my bedroom window wide open. I never opened it. I hate the sound of bugs, the creak of old shutters, and I know I'd locked it the night before. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd forgotten. But it happened again and again, every single night, and always only that one window. It wasn't long before I noticed things inside the house were subtly shifting. Furniture would be off center, my toothbrush would be in the wrong spot. I even found my shoes turned around, perfectly placed, but facing the wrong direction like someone had stood in them backwards. I started keeping a journal to document it all. Part of me hoped writing it down would help me see a pattern or prove I wasn't losing my mind. Then one night, I woke to the sound of breathing, not mine. Heavy, uneven breathing from the foot of my bed. I sat frozen in the dark, too terrified to move, my eyes straining to see if someone was there. The room was empty, but I swear I heard it for a solid minute before it slowly faded into silence. I turned on every light in the house that night and didn't sleep a second. The next day, I noticed something carved into the inside of my closet door. I hadn't seen it before, but the scratch marks were fresh, jagged, almost desperate. 4 words. He still lives here. My stomach dropped. I called a locksmith and had every lock changed. I even installed cameras in the hallway in my room, just to be sure. But the cameras would glitch out randomly during the night, always between 3 and 4 a.m. One night, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, dragging footsteps. I checked the monitors, nothing, but the sound kept coming, closer and closer, until it stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting for it to open, but it didn't. Instead, I heard the softest knock, just once, a single tap, and then silent. I stayed awake until sunrise. The final straw was what I saw on the footage the next morning. It was only a few seconds, but enough to make me leave that house forever. Around 3:17 a.m., the camera in my bedroom glitched, then flickered back on for one frame. And in that frame, standing directly beside my bed, was a tall, shadowy figure, thin arms, distorted face, and 2 gleaming, unnatural eyes, almost glowing. It was leaning over me as I slept. And then, just like that, the frame cut out. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just left. I've never gone back to that house, and I never will. But sometimes, in unfamiliar places, I still wake up to the sound of breathing that isn't mine, and I wonder, did I leave him behind, or did he follow me? I thought I'd found a perfect place to start over. The house was small but charming, nestled at the end of a gravel road surrounded by thick woods. It had this rustic warmth to it, wooden floors, a brick fireplace, and an old shed out back. It felt like the kind of place where a person could finally breathe. I had no idea what was waiting for me beneath the surface of that peaceful facade. The first night was uneventful, quiet even. I unpacked, cooked a small dinner, and fell asleep on the couch with the TV humming softly in the background. But sometime after midnight, I woke up abruptly. There was no sound, no movement, no light, just an overwhelming sense of dread that wrapped around my chest like a vice. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but when I looked out the window facing the woods, I saw something or someone standing between the trees. It was tall, still, watching. I turned away, blinking hard, thinking I was half asleep or imagining things. When I looked back, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, maybe a tree stump. But the next morning, I found something unsettling near the back door. A muddy footprint. One, just one. Too large to be mine, and it was facing the house. I tried brushing it off. New environments mess with people. But that night I heard scratching, faint at first, then more deliberate, like fingernails scraping wood. It was coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the living room paneling, and I could swear I heard movement, slow dragging, like something was crawling inside the walls themselves. The noises didn't stop after that. Some nights it was scratching. Other times it was tapping, small rhythmic knocks that seemed to come from different parts of the house each time. I started keeping a bat near my bed, though I had no idea what good it would actually do. I checked the attic and the crawl space. Nothing. No signs of animals, no signs of anything. Then came the voices. They didn't sound like people, not quite. They were warped, like broken recordings, distorted whispers, repeating nonsense syllables over and over. Sometimes I'd hear them right behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. Sometimes they echoed from under the floorboard. It became impossible to sleep. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash in the kitchen. I ran down and found all the drawers open, every cabinet door hanging wide. Plates shattered on the floor. There was a message scrawled across the wall in what looked like charcoal dust. "Don't go in the shed." I hadn't even touched the shed yet. It was old and rusted shut when I moved in, and I'd figured I'd deal with it later. But after that message, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I needed to know what was inside. The next morning, I forced the shed door open with a crowbar. It reeked of damp earth and rot. There was nothing inside at first, just cobwebs, old tools, broken shelves. But then I noticed the trap door in the corner. covered by a sheet of rotting plywood. When I pried it open, a cold draft rose from below. A narrow staircase led into the ground. Against every instinct I had, I climbed down with a flashlight. The space beneath the shed was a makeshift room. Dirt walls, candles melted into the ground, symbols carved into the soil, and in the center, a small pile of bones, human. Scattered among them were broken dolls, bits of old fabric, and a rusted mirror leaning against the wall. When my flashlight passed over it, I saw movement, not mine, reflected in the glass, something tall, thin, and slowly shifting behind me. I didn't turn around. I ran. I sealed the shed and left that night. But since then, I've been seeing things in my peripheral vision. Reflections still show movement that isn't mine. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear tapping again. Soft, deliberate, always in threes. I've never gone back to that house, but I have a feeling that whatever was under that shed wasn't meant to be disturbed, and now it's not under the shed anymore. The house was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce. It was a modest two-bedroom on a quiet street, nothing fancy, but it had a kind of stillness to it that I thought I needed. A blank slate. I moved in during the early days of spring, and everything felt oddly peaceful, too peaceful. At first, I thought I was just not used to the silence after years of arguing and chaos. But this silence wasn't comforting. It was hollow. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl after dark. I began to notice small things first. My keys wouldn't be where I left them. Lights I was certain I'd turned off would be on again when I got home. The TV would sometimes switch channels on its own, always to static or old news stations from decades ago. But it was the bathroom mirror that really started everything. One night after brushing my teeth, I caught something in the mirror, a shadow, not mine. It moved differently, slower, almost delayed, like a second version of lagging behind. At first, I chalked it up to being tired, but it didn't stop. Every time I looked in that mirror, there it was, a second reflection that didn't belong. Sometimes, it would smile even when I wasn't. Other times, I'd turn my head and it wouldn't. I covered the mirror with a towel, but that didn't help. I started seeing it in windows too. My reflection, behaving wrong, tilting its head when I didn't, standing perfectly still behind me in glass doors. One time, it raised its hand while mine stayed down. I remember dropping the glass I was holding and backing out of the room without taking my eyes off the window. Then came the dreams, if they were even dreams at all. I'd wake up in my bed, unable to move, feeling something crawl onto the mattress beside me. Heavy, slow pressure sinking into the mattress like a body lying next to mine. I couldn't turn my head, couldn't scream. All I could do was feel its breath near my ear, cold, wet, whispering words I couldn't understand, but somehow still feared. One morning, I found my closet door open. Inside, everything was untouched, but scribbled across the inside wall in chalk was a phrase, "The reflection is not you." I hadn't written that. No one had been in my house. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. I even contacted a mirror removal service to get rid of every reflective surface in the house. The man who came to do the job stared at me strangely when I explained why, but he didn't ask questions. He took the mirrors out, and for a few days, I thought maybe it was over, until I saw it again. Not in a mirror, but in my dream. Only this time, it didn't mimic me. It stood in the hallway, watching, unmoving. When I woke up, my bedroom door was wide open and muddy footprints led from the hallway to the foot of my bed. I don't even own shoes like that. I installed a security camera in the hallway. That night, I reviewed the footage. At exactly 3:39 a.m., the door to my room opened slowly. Nothing visible entered at first, but then a faint outline appeared. It looked like a smudge on the lens, only it moved with terrifying purpose, gliding toward my bed. It stood there for 5 minutes, watching me sleep, then vanished. I haven't been able to sleep since. And the worst part? Yesterday, while walking past a shop window downtown, I caught a glimpse of myself, only it wasn't me. My reflection stood still while I kept walking. And then, slowly, it smiled. I don't think it's confined to the house anymore. I think it's following me. I moved into the house after inheriting it from my late uncle. He had lived there alone for over 20 years, completely isolated from the rest of the family. I remembered visiting only once as a child, a vague memory filled with shadows, thick curtains, and the lingering scent of something metallic in the air. Still, I convinced myself that those memories were just distorted fragments of childhood fear. The house needed some work, but it was structurally sound, and I saw it as a project, maybe even a permanent home. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, like it had been holding its breath for decades. Dust hung in the sunlight like smoke. The furniture was old and untouched, exactly as my uncle had left it. A record player still sat in the corner, covered in a thick sheet, And then there was the basement door, padlocked shut from the outside. That should have been my first warning. The first few days were quiet. I cleaned, rearranged things, and tried to bring life into the house. But every night, just after 2 a.m., I would hear a noise, faint at first, like low, muffled humming. It came from beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was old pipes or some strange acoustics from the basement. But the humming became clearer with each passing night, like a voice, a man's voice, singing in a low monotone. I finally decided to break the lock on the basement. The moment I opened it, a wave of cold air hit me, unnatural, like stepping into a crypt. The staircase descended into complete darkness. I used my flashlight to navigate down, each step creaking beneath my weight. The basement was nothing like I expected. It was large, far larger than the layout of the house should have allowed, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into the stone, circles, eyes, figures that looked half human, half something else. In the far corner of the basement was a chair, an old wooden one, bolted to the ground. Chains dangled from the arms and legs, and carved into the wall behind it was a single phrase, repeated over and over again. The echo must be fed. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to. I left the basement and sealed the door again. But that night, the singing was louder, almost rhythmic now. It felt like it was echoing in my head, vibrating in my bones. I barely slept. When I woke up, I found something horrifying. There were scratches on my bedroom walls. Not claw marks, but writing. "You broke the seal." I tried to leave the house that day, packed a bag, and went for the front door. But it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Every window was sealed tight. My phone stopped working. No signal, no service, nothing. And then came the footsteps. Every night, pacing above my bedroom in the attic, I hadn't even realized it existed. But when I went up there, it was empty, except for the old record player. And when I looked closer, I saw the same symbols etched beneath it, glowing faintly under the dust. I tried destroying it. I smashed the record player, burned the chair in the basement, scraped the carvings off the walls. But nothing stopped the singing. It only changed it. Now it wasn't humming, it was whispering, repeating my name in that same low tone, over and over. Last night I woke up with dirt and my fingernails were caked in soil. I checked the basement. There was a hole in the floor, a tunnel, dug with bare hands, and something had crawled out of it. I don't know what it is. I don't know what my uncle locked away down there, but it's in the house now. I hear it walking at night, tapping at my bedroom door. I haven't opened it, but I know it will, and when it does, I'm afraid I'll recognize its voice, because it sounds exactly like it was supposed to be our dream home. My wife and I had saved for years before we finally found it. A cozy, two-story house nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac on the edge of town. It was older, built in the 1940s, but beautifully preserved. Arched doorways, hardwood floors, and a large backyard for our future kids. Everything felt perfect, but from the very first night, the house didn't feel right. It started with the feeling of being watched, subtle but constant. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder while walking up the stairs, sensing eyes on my back. My wife dismissed it as stress from the move, and I tried to believe that too. But things got worse. The first truly strange thing happened 2 weeks in. I was home alone, unpacking boxes in the study, when I heard footsteps upstairs. Not creaking floorboard, distinct, slow steps, heavy. I froze, thinking maybe my wife had come home early. But when I called out, no one answered. I checked the rooms, nothing. Every door and window was still locked. Later that night, my wife mentioned something odd. She said she'd found a door behind one of the shelves in the bedroom closet, a door we hadn't noticed during the walkthrough. I didn't believe her at first, but she insisted, so I checked. Sure enough, hidden behind coats and a sliding shelf, there was a small wooden door embedded into the wall. It led to a narrow hallway, barely wide enough to walk through, dust-choked and cold. At the end was a tiny room with a slanted ceiling, empty except for a small wooden crib. It looked handmade, old, and worn. There were scratch marks on the inside, like something or someone had tried to claw their way out. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding. Something about that space felt deeply wrong. We sealed the door the next morning, boarded it up, tried to forget about it. But the house wouldn't let us. My wife started having dreams. Nightmares, really? She'd wake up in a cold sweat, saying she saw a figure standing in the corner of the bedroom, a pale, faceless child with hollow eyes. She swore it whispered her name. Soon, she wasn't the only one. I began waking up in strange places, in the hallway, in the basement, once even outside, on the porch, with dirt under my nails. I don't remember how I got there. I started hearing crying at night, soft and distant, like a baby's whimper coming from behind the walls. And that's when I realized the sound always came from the direction of that hidden room. One evening, I tried to find the hallway again. I tore down the boards, moved the shelf, but the door was gone, completely vanished. In its place was just smooth wall, as if it had never been there. That same night, my wife screamed in her sleep. When I turned on the light, I saw the bruises, finger-shaped marks on her arms and neck, as if someone had grabbed her. She begged me to leave the house. I agreed. We packed up and stayed at a hotel for a few days. When we came back to gather the rest of our things, the house was silent, too silent. But everything inside was changed. The furniture had been rearranged. The photos on the walls were altered. Faces were missing. Ours were blurred. And then we found the note. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, written in shaky handwriting. Neither of us recognized. It simply read, "You were never meant to leave." The child still cries. We left that night and never returned. But I still hear the crying late at night, just before I drift off to sleep. It echoes in the corners of my mind, like a memory I can't erase. And sometimes, I swear I see that pale figure in the reflection of the bedroom mirror, watching, still waiting, still whispering. I moved into the house because it was cheap, too cheap, really. A 4-bedroom farmhouse, a few miles outside the city, for less than half its market value. The realtor said the previous owner had passed away, and the family just wanted it gone quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I needed a place to start over, and this seemed like fate giving me a break. The house was old, but beautiful. Worn oak floors, vintage light fixtures, and creaky charm that felt oddly comforting. But that comfort didn't last long. The first night, I noticed something strange. All the mirrors in the house were either broken or missing. Every bathroom, every hallway. No reflective surfaces anywhere. Even the medicine cabinet had been pried off the wall. I assumed it was just the previous owner's oddity, maybe superstition. I shrugged it off and brought in my own mirror, setting it up in the hallway. That's when things began to shift. It started with flashes, brief glimpses of movement in the mirror when I passed by. Not my reflection, not shadows, but something else. A flicker of someone standing behind me, gone the second I turned around. I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then I started seeing her. A pale woman, long, stringy black hair, eyes that didn't seem human, too wide, too dark, always standing just behind me in the reflection, motionless. At first, I thought it was sleep deprivation. Then, I started seeing her outside the mirror too, in the corners of rooms, at the end of the hallway, in the faint reflection of the window panes at night. I tried removing the mirror, thinking it would stop, but it didn't. I started waking up with bruises on my arms, cold patches in bed where no one had been. Lights flickered every time I walked past that hallway. The worst part? My reflection began changing. Subtly at first, a delayed movement, a slightly different expression, a head tilt that didn't match my own. I'd stand perfectly still, and my reflection would smile. It wasn't me anymore. One night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I ran into the hallway and found the mirror had fallen, completely smashed on the floor. I felt relief until I noticed something. The reflection was still there. In the shards of glass, she stood clearly, closer, clearer, staring directly at me. That night, I had a dream, or what I thought was a dream, of being dragged into a mirror. I couldn't breathe. I could see my real body screaming for help from the other side as she pulled me in. When I woke up, my body ached like I had been in a fight. My hands were cut. There were shards of glass under my nails. I boarded up the hallway, covered every reflective surface I could find. I even tried to move out, but every time I packed my things, the boxes would be emptied by morning. The doors would lock themselves. The car wouldn't start. It was like the house was sealing me in. And then I saw the writing appear, faint at first, then darker each, etched across the wall in the hallway. She doesn't want your reflection. She wants your place. I don't know how much longer I have. I'm starting to feel different, detached, like something inside me is slipping away. My hands shake. My face in the mirror looks unfamiliar, just slightly off, too symmetrical, too perfect. Sometimes, when I speak, there's a delay in my reflection's mouth, and I'm not sure if I'm still on this. Maybe she's already taken my place. Maybe I'm the one trapped behind the glass now. When I first bought the house, I was just looking for peace. I'd spent years living in the city, surrounded by noise and people, always feeling on edge. This place, an old, stone-built cottage nestled in a quiet, forested hilltop, seemed like exactly what I needed. No neighbors for miles, no traffic, no distraction, just silence. I didn't realize how loud silence could be. It began the second week. I'd be reading at night when I'd hear scratching sound, soft at first, like an animal in the walls. I assumed it was rats, but when I checked, I couldn't find any droppings, no holes, no signs of infestation. The sound, though, became more frequent, more deliberate. Not scurrying, but slow dragging, as if something had claws and was drawing them across the floorboards under the house. Then, the whispers started. At first, I thought they were in my head, faint, fragmented sentences that never made sense, just murmurs carried on the still air. I'd freeze, strain my ears to listen, but the words would always vanish before I could understand them. Sometimes they came from the walls, other times from beneath the floorboard. Once, I heard them clearly in my own voice, whispering from behind me. I tore the house apart, trying to find a logical explanation. I checked the pipes, inspected the chimney, even slept outside for a night just to see if it stopped. It didn't. And that's when I found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath the old woven rug in the living room, a small wooden hatch, barely noticeable. I had walked over it dozens of times and never felt it. When I pried it open, I found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air down there was different, colder, heavier. The basement was unfinished, with stone walls and dirt floors. But what disturbed me was what I found in the corner. An old wooden chair, rotted and warped, facing the wall. Above it, scratched into the stone, were hundreds of tally marks. And beneath that, a message etched in jagged, desperate lines. It watches from the dark. I got out of there fast. I boarded the trapdoor shut and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. But that only made things worse. The sounds became more aggressive, banging in the walls, knocking under my bed. My sleep was filled with dreams of being trapped underground, sitting in that chair, scratching tally marks until my fingers bled. I'd wake up with dirt under my nails, blood on my fingertips. My hair started falling out in clumps. My skin grew pale and thin. It was like something was feeding on me. Then came the night I saw it. It stood in the hallway, tall and hunched, its skin gray and wet-looking, like it had been buried in damp soil for years. Its face, there wasn't a face, just a gaping hole where features should have been. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it, staring, watching. After that, I started seeing it everywhere, in the corners of rooms, in reflections, even in my dreams. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I tried to leave the house, but every time I packed, the bags would be emptied by morning. Every time I tried to drive away, the engine would fail. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of the trapdoor again. I don't even remember walking there. It was like I was being pulled. I opened it and went down. The chair was still there, waiting. I don't know how long I sat in it. Hours? Days? I started scratching tally marks on the wall without thinking. It felt right. That's when I heard it whisper again, clear and close. "You're mine now." I don't remember what happened next. I woke up upstairs in bed, covered in dirt. The trapdoor sealed again. But the whispers haven't stopped. I hear them constantly now, even during the day. The figure visits me at night, standing closer each time. I've started sleepwalking. Last night, I found tally marks on my bedroom wall. I know I should leave. I know I have to escape. But something in me doesn't want to. Something in me feels like this has always been home. When I first bought the house, I was just looking for peace. I'd spent years living in the city, surrounded by noise and people, always feeling on edge. This place, an old stone-built cottage nestled in a quiet forested hilltop, seemed like exactly what I needed. No neighbors for miles, no traffic, no distraction, just silence. I didn't realize how loud silence could be. It began the second week. I'd be reading at night when I'd hear scratching sound, soft at first, like an animal in the walls. I assumed it was rats, but when I checked, I couldn't find any droppings, no holes, no signs of infestation. The sound, though, became more frequent, more deliberate. Not scurrying, but slow dragging, as if something had claws and was drawing them across the floorboards under the house. Then, the whispers started. At first, I thought they were in my head, faint, fragmented sentences that never made sense, just murmurs carried on the still air. I'd freeze, strain my ears to listen, but the words would always vanish before I could understand them. Sometimes they came from the walls, other times from beneath the floorboard. Once, I heard them clearly in my own voice, whispering from behind me. I tore the house apart, trying to find a logical explanation. I checked the pipes, inspected the chimney, even slept outside for a night just to see if it stopped. It didn't. And that's when I found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath the old woven rug in the living room, a small wooden hatch, barely noticeable. I had walked over it dozens of times and never felt it. When I pried it open, I found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air down there was different, colder, heavier. The basement was unfinished, with stone walls and dirt floors. But what disturbed me was what I found in the corner. An old wooden chair, rotted and warped, facing the wall. Above it, scratched into the stone, were hundreds of tally marks. And beneath that, a message etched in jagged, desperate lines. It watches from the dark. I got out of there fast. I boarded the trapdoor shut and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. But that only made things worse. The sounds became more aggressive, banging in the walls, knocking under my bed. My sleep was filled with dreams of being trapped underground, sitting in that chair, scratching tally marks until my fingers bled. I'd wake up with dirt under my nails, blood on my fingertips. My hair started falling out in clumps. My skin grew pale and thin. It was like something was feeding on me. Then came the night I saw it. It stood in the hallway, tall and hunched, its skin gray and wet-looking, like it had been buried in damp soil for years. Its face, there wasn't a face, just a gaping hole where features should have been. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it, staring, watching. After that, I started seeing it everywhere, in the corners of rooms, in reflections, even in my dreams. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I tried to leave the house, but every time I packed, the bags would be emptied by morning. Every time I tried to drive away, the engine would fail. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of the trapdoor again. I don't even remember walking there. It was like I was being pulled. I opened it and went down. The chair was still there, waiting. I don't know how long I sat in it. Hours? Days? I started scratching tally marks on the wall without thinking. It felt right. That's when I heard it whisper again, clear and close. You're mine now. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up upstairs in bed, covered in dirt. The trapdoor sealed again, but the whispers haven't stopped. I hear them constantly now, even during the day. The figure visits me at night, standing closer each time. I've started sleepwalking. Last night I found tally marks on my bedroom wall. I know I should leave. I know I have to escape, but something in me doesn't want to. Something in me feels like this has always been home. I didn't want the house. It wasn't even on my list, but my wife fell in love with it the second we pulled up the driveway. A quaint little Victorian on a quiet cul-de-sac, freshly painted ivy, curling up the porch rails, big windows letting in golden light. It looked like something out of a storybook. I couldn't shake the feeling that it looked too perfect, but she was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. So I signed the papers. The first few days were fine. Better than fine, actually. The neighborhood was peaceful, the house stayed cool even during the heat wave, and we started settling into a routine. But then she found the door. It was hidden behind a bookshelf in the upstairs hallway. A narrow wooden door, no handle, just a keyhole that didn't match any key we had. She became obsessed with it, said she could hear something behind it. Whispers, faint tapping sounds, and once, what she swore was a lullaby. At first, I laughed it off, told her it was probably an old crawl space or maybe just the wind echoing through bad insulation. But she started talking about the door constantly, at dinner, in bed, even in her sleep. I caught her more than once just standing there, staring at it like she was waiting for it to open. Then the changes began. She'd forget conversations we had hours earlier. She'd drift off mid-sentence, eyes blank, almost like she was somewhere else. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and walk straight to the door, whispering things I couldn't understand in a voice that didn't sound like hers. I tried moving the bookshelf back to cover it, but every time I did, it was pushed aside again the next day. One morning, I woke up and found her gone. No note, no message, just gone. I searched the entire house, called her friends, even the police. Nothing. But when I went back upstairs, the door was wide open. Behind it was a narrow passageway leading to a small, windowless room with peeling wallpaper and a cracked porcelain doll sitting in the corner. The air was thick and bitterly cold, and on the walls were dozens of names, scratched into the paint with fingernails, like a desperate list of those who had come before. My wife's name was the last one added. I ran out of that room and slammed the door shut, but it never stayed closed. Every night it creaks open a little more. I've tried sealing it, bolting it, even destroying it. Nothing works. The whispers are louder now, not just from the door, but all around the house. And I've started forgetting things too. Simple things, dates, faces, words. Some nights I wake up standing in front of that door. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember walking down the hall. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of her behind me, smiling, eyes hollow, whispering something I can't quite hear yet. But I will. I know I will. Because whatever that room is, it isn't done with me either. When I moved into the house, I was alone for the first time in my life. It was a new chapter, fresh start, new job, new town. The house wasn't special, just a small two-bedroom rental on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The landlord said it had been empty for a while. I didn't care. I just wanted silence. But the house didn't feel empty. It started on my second night. I woke up to the sound of breathing, not mine, not through the walls or from outside, but close, right next to me. When I turned on the light, nothing was. I blamed it on stress. I'd been working late, barely sleeping. I brushed it off, but the breathing kept returning. Then I began hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate ones, always in the hallway, always in the same rhythm. 2 steps, pause, 2 steps again. But when I checked, the hallway would be empty. No open doors, no footprints, nothing. I kept telling myself I was imagining until I found the handprints. They were on the bathroom mirror, small, pale smears, like someone had pressed damp fingers against the glass. I lived alone. I hadn't had visitors, and they weren't mine. Every morning. Then came the knocks, soft taps on the walls at night, always in threes. I started recording them on my phone. But when I played the audio back, it wasn't just knocking. There were whispers under, words I couldn't understand, voices layered over each other in a language that didn't sound human. It made my stomach twist just listening. I told a coworker about it one day, half joking, half desperate. He went pale and said something strange. That house? Wasn't it the one where the guy went missing? I pressed him for more, and he told me about the last tenant, a young man who'd moved in alone and vanished. No signs of struggle, just disappeared. The landlord hadn't said a word about it when I signed the lease. After that, I started noticing something else. My reflection wasn't always right. Sometimes, when I passed a mirror too quickly, it didn't follow exactly. Once, I caught it smiling when I wasn't. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. One night, I came home to find all the lights on. Every room, every switch flipped. I knew I hadn't left them. And on the hallway wall, scratched deep into the plaster, was one word: stay. I packed that night. I didn't care about the lease or the job anymore. But as I stepped out with my bags, something slammed the front door shut behind me. I turned around, and for just a second, I saw a face in the upstairs window. Not mine. Not anyone I recognized. Just hollow eyes, watching. I ran. I've never been back. I've never spoken to the landlord again. But sometimes, in my new apartment, I hear faint knocking on the walls. Always in threes. And in my dreams, I'm still in that house. Something followed me. Something never wanted me to leave. I didn't want to move back home, but after my divorce, I didn't have many choices. My mother had passed years ago, and the family house had sat untouched ever since, gathering dust at the end of a forgotten road in the countryside. I figured I'd stay for a few months, fix it up, maybe sell it, and start fresh. The house hadn't changed much, still smelled faintly of old wood and lavender oil. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and everything had a layer of dust, like the house had been holding its breath. But the moment I walked inside, it felt heavier than I remembered, like the air was thicker, denser. The first night, I heard the piano playing. My mother's old upright in the sitting room had been silent for over a decade, but around midnight I heard soft, familiar notes drifting through the house, broken chords, the same ones she used to play when she couldn't sleep. I crept downstairs, heart pounding, only to find the piano lid closed and untouched. I stood there, confused, until I noticed something that chilled me more than the music. There was a single indentation in the dusty cushion of the piano bench, as if someone had just been sitting there. I tried convincing myself it was my imagination, stress, old memories playing tricks on me. But over the next few nights, things got stranger. The old cuckoo clock in the hallway started working again, despite the fact it hadn't had batteries in years. The same hour every night, it would chime softly, followed by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I'd wake up to footsteps outside my room, soft, dragging steps, like someone in slippers shuffling down the hallway. Once, I opened the door fast enough to catch a glimpse of a figure turning the corner. I followed, but the hallway was empty, and the guest bedroom door had creaked open on its own. That room was always cold. I never liked that room as a kid. My mother always kept it locked, and I never knew why. But now it was mine to explore. Inside, I found a single twin bed, a rocking chair, and an old wooden wardrobe. The wallpaper peeling in places, and the ceiling had water stains I didn't remember. What disturbed me most, though, were the scratch marks on the inside of the wardrobe door. Long, desperate gouges, like someone had tried to claw their way out. I started having dreams. Nightmares, really, of a pale woman standing at the foot of my bed, whispering something I couldn't understand, pointing toward the guest room. Every night, her voice grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. And when I woke up one morning, the words she whispered were scrawled across my bedroom mirror in condensation. Let her out. I finally went back to the wardrobe. Something inside me screamed not to open it again, but I had to know. This time, I noticed a false panel at the back. When I pried it loose, I found a hollow space, and inside, a child's shoe, brittle with age, and an old journal. It was my mother's. The entries grew darker with each page. She spoke of a girl, a foster child she'd taken in briefly, one the records never mentioned. The girl had become strange, talking to shadows, scratching herself raw, screaming at night that someone was trapped in the wall. My mother had locked her in the guest room when she got violent, and she disappeared soon after. The last journal entry was barely legible, just one haunting line over and over. I can still hear her crying. I moved out the next day, but sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and hear piano notes echoing through my apartment, low, soft, mournful, and every so often, I see a pale girl in the corner of my eye. She's still pointing, still waiting. I didn't believe in ghosts. I've always been the skeptic in the family, the one who rolls his eyes at horror stories and rationalizes every strange sound as plumbing or wind. So when my sister begged me to come help her move into her new house, claiming it felt wrong, I brushed it off as nerves. The house wasn't old or creepy. In fact, it was a sleek, modern two-story in a suburban neighborhood. Everything looked brand new. Clean walls, shining hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, letting in tons of natural light. But despite all that, there was something off. I felt it the second I stepped inside. Not fear exactly, just pressure, like the house was watching me. My sister said she hadn't been sleeping well, kept waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m., hearing strange sounds from the attic. Sometimes scratching, sometimes muffled footsteps, sometimes what sounded like furniture being dragged. We checked the attic on the first night. Nothing was up there except insulation and a few boxes left by the previous owners. But the next morning, those boxes were open. One of them had a child's doll inside, hand-stitched, porcelain face cracked, a faint red stain on the lace dress. Neither of us remembered seeing it the night before. Then her dog started acting weird. He'd refuse to go upstairs, whining at the base of the steps, tail tucked between his legs. When we tried to drag him up, he'd growl, something he'd never done before. He'd just sit there at night, staring at the staircase like something was standing at the top. And then came the mirror. There was a full-length mirror in the master bedroom, built into the closet door. A sleek modern piece with a beveled edge, but the reflection always felt delayed, like it took a split second too long to catch up with our movement. At first I thought I was imagining, until one night I caught something. I was walking past the hallway and caught a glimpse of the bedroom mirror through the door. In the reflection, there was a person standing behind me, tall, dark figure with no face. I spun around, but no one was there. When I looked back at the mirror, it was gone. My sister started changing after that. She'd space out mid-conversation. Her eyes would glaze over, and sometimes she'd mumble things under her breath, words that didn't sound like English. She'd wake up with scratches on her arms and back, but there were no sharp objects in her bed, no explanation. One night, I found her in the hallway, just standing in front of the mirror, whispering to her. When I called her name, she didn't react, just kept whispering. I had to physically shake her to snap her out of it. She didn't remember any of it. The final straw came when I found her trying to rip up the floorboards in the hallway. She was frantic, muttering, "It's under here! It's buried under here!" Her hands were bleeding, nails cracked, splinters stuck in her fingers. I pulled her away and took her to the hospital. She was sedated and kept overnight for observation. While she was gone, I stayed in the house alone. That night, I heard the attic hatch creak open on its own. I stood beneath it, staring up into the darkness, heart racing. And then something dropped from above, an old photograph. It was black and white, curled at the edges, a family portrait. But in the corner of the photo, half faded, was that same doll we found in the box. And standing behind the family was a dark figure, faceless, shadowy, the same one I saw in the mirror. I left the house immediately and had my sister move in with me. The house is still there, unsold, untouched. Every real estate agent we've worked with says the same thing. People walk in and immediately feel uneasy. No one ever makes it to the second floor. And that mirror? We smashed it before we left. But I still see glimpses of that figure in reflective surfaces. Storefront windows, puddles, my rearview mirror. Just a flicker, and then it's gone. But I know it followed it. I know it's still watching, and I don't think it's done with it. When my fiance and I bought our first home, it felt like a dream. It wasn't a huge place, a modest single-story house in a quiet neighborhood with a little porch and a backyard big enough for summer barbecue. It had been on the market for a suspiciously low price, but the realtor told us the previous owner had moved out abruptly and just wanted to sell quickly. We didn't ask questions. We were too excited to start our life together. The first few weeks were fine. We painted the walls, unpacked our boxes, and started settling in. But even then, I noticed something strange. Every time I walked past the hallway leading to the guest room, I felt cold. Not just a draft, but a biting, creeping chill that seemed to cling to my skin. My fiancé said it was probably bad insulation. I wanted to believe that. Then the tapping started. At first, it was soft, like a single knock on the wall. I thought maybe it was the house settling. But it kept happening, always at night, always from inside the guest room. One night, I stood outside the door and listened. The tapping grew louder, more rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping their fingernails along the wall. Following a pattern, I finally went in. The room was empty, but the closet door was open. That was strange. I knew I had closed it earlier. I looked inside and found something wedged behind the shoe rack, a piece of folded paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter, written in neat cursive, but most of the words had been scratched out violently, as if someone had tried to erase them with a blade. Only a few phrases remained visible. She watches from the walls. Don't listen when she whispers. If you see her in the mirror, don't turn around. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. That night, I dreamed of a woman standing in the guest room, pale, wet hair clinging to her face, fingernails tapping the wall in that same rhythm. When I woke up, the closet door was open again. I tried to ignore it, but things escalated quickly. Lights began flickering in the hallway. Doors slammed on their own. My fiancée heard the tapping too, but she refused to admit something was wrong. One night, while brushing her teeth, she screamed and ran out of the bathroom, shaking. She said she saw something in the mirror, something standing behind her, even though she'd been alone. We installed a motion camera in the guest room. The next morning, we reviewed the footage. At exactly 3:11 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. There was a shadow in the corner of the room, just for a second, human-shaped, tall, still. But what chilled me the most was the sound the camera picked up. Tapping, same rhythm, same pace, followed by a whisper that was barely audible. Come look in the mirror. We tried everything, cleansing rituals, priests, even paranormal investigators, but nothing changed. Eventually, we decided to stop using the guest room altogether. We kept it locked, but even then, sometimes we'd hear the tapping from behind the door, and worse, the whispers. 2 months ago, we decided to sell the house, but something has changed in my fiancée. She's quieter, distant. Some nights I catch her standing in front of the bathroom mirror, whispering softly to no one, and last week I woke up to find her standing in the hallway, eyes fixed on the guest room door. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled faintly and said, she just wanted to talk. I don't know who she is anymore, and I don't know if I ever really brought my fiancé out of that room. I've never been someone who believes in haunted houses. I've always thought fear was something we created in our own minds until I moved into that house on Elm Ridge Drive. I'd just gotten divorced, and the house was supposed to be a fresh start. It was small, quiet, tucked at the edge of a dense patch of. The solitude was comforting at first. It gave me space to think, to heal. But it didn't take long for that peaceful silence to start feeling oppressive. The first odd thing I noticed was the floor in the hallway. Every time I walked over the same spot, it creaked. 3 short creaks in perfect rhythm, even if I walked gently. I thought it was just the wood settling, but then I started hearing it when I wasn't in the hallway. Always at night. Always 3 creaks, like someone walking. I'd wake up and stare at the ceiling, heart pounding, waiting to hear it again. Sometimes I'd hear it multiple times a night. 3 creaks, pause, 3 more. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed. One night I heard it again, but this time it didn't stop at 3. The sound moved slowly toward my bedroom door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but the light bulb above that same floorboard flickered once, then went out completely. I tried ignoring it, but things kept getting worse. One evening, I found dirt on the living room floor, just a few muddy footprints leading from the back door toward the hallway. I checked the door, it was locked. I checked all the windows, nothing was open, but the footprints were there, and they didn't belong to me. Then there were the whispers, soft, breathy voices that came from the walls. I couldn't make out words, just the tone, low, pleading, almost mournful. They'd start late at night, always near that hallway. Sometimes I thought I heard my name. Then the dreams began. I kept seeing a figure standing at the end of the hallway. A man, maybe? Always out of focus, dressed in rags, eyes black and empty. Sometimes he'd crawl toward me, dragging something behind him. Something heavy, something alive. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and still hear the floor creaking. I called a local contractor to check under the floorboards. He looked uneasy when he saw the hallway and said something strange. You know this place used to be part of the old mill property, right? Workers died here. They say the land's cursed. I laughed it off at the time, but I stopped laughing when he lifted the first floorboard and found a small, rusted metal box. Inside were teeth, human teeth, perfectly arranged in neat rows, like a collection. We called the police. They took the box but never got back to me. A few days later, that same contractor died in an accident, fell from his own roof. His death shook me more than I'd like to admit. I started sleeping with all the lights on, but the shadows still came. They moved across the walls, growing longer even when there was no source. One night, I caught a glimpse of something crawling across my bedroom ceiling, limbs bending the wrong way, face twisted in a silent scream. And then, one night, everything stopped. No creaks, no whispers, no shadows. It was almost worse. The silence felt artificial, like the house was holding its breath. I barely slept that night. Just before dawn, I heard something, soft crying from the hallway. I opened my bedroom door, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty. But on the floor, where the floorboard used to creak, there was a message scratched into the wood. Beneath still sleeps what walks in silence. I moved out the next day. I didn't pack most of my things. I didn't look back. And even now, miles away, I sometimes wake up at night to the sound of three creaks. Slow, deliberate, impossibly close. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, but I don't believe that anymore. When I moved into my new house, I wasn't looking for anything special. Just peace, quiet, and a place to start over. It was a small two-bedroom home at the end of a dead-end street. Nothing extravagant, just affordable and secluded. Exactly what I needed after a messy breakup and a string of bad luck. The place had been vacant for a while, but it looked well kept, like someone had cleaned it just before I arrived. Everything felt untouched, yet strangely lived in. I noticed the mirror on the hallway wall my very first day. It wasn't anything fancy, oval-shaped, set in a thick wooden frame that looked older than the rest of the house. I didn't remember seeing it in the photos online, and when I asked the landlord about it, he just said, "It's always been there." I should have taken that more seriously. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Tiny flickers in the mirror when I walked past it, shadows that didn't match my movement, shapes behind me that vanished when I turned. I blamed it on stress, on overthinking, on too many horror movies. Then, one night, I saw her. I was brushing my teeth, the hallway mirror reflecting behind me from the angle of the bathroom door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing there. A woman, pale skin, long black hair hanging down, wearing something tattered and soaked. I spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The mirror still showed her, just standing there, watching me. After that night, things started happening fast. Lights would dim when I walked past the mirror. Doors creaked open by themselves. Sometimes, when I looked directly into the glass, I saw my own reflection smiling, even when I wasn't. I tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but it never stayed in place. I'd wake up and find the cloth on the floor, neatly folded. I removed the mirror from the wall entirely and put it in the garage. The next morning, it was back, hanging exactly where it had been, spotless. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering, low, almost like humming. I followed the noise down the hallway, half asleep, only to find the mirror glowing faintly. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, the reflection changed. It wasn't my hallway anymore. It was something else entirely. A rotting corridor covered in black mold, walls dripping with moisture. And at the end, she was there again. This time, she moved. I heard her voice in my head, not through sound, but a sharp pressure behind my eyes. "Let me out." I smashed the mirror the next day. Glass flew everywhere. I swept it up, tossed it in the trash, and left it on the curb. But when I came home from work, the mirror was back on the wall, flawless. No cracks, no damage. That night, my phone rang at exactly 3 a.m. I answered without thinking. Silence. Then, the sound of glass cracking. I've since boarded up that part of the hallway. I don't go near it anymore. I sleep with the bedroom door locked and avoid mirrors altogether. But sometimes late at night, I hear movement behind the wall, fingernails dragging along the wall, breathing, soft whispers. And once, just once, I saw something in the reflection of the TV screen while it was off. She was standing behind me again, and she was smiling. I never believed a house could choose its occupant until I moved into this one. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few months while my permanent place finished construction. A friend of a friend had offered the house for dirt cheap rent. "Nobody lasts long there," he said with a half joke, "but maybe you'll be different." At first glance, the place didn't seem unusual. A bit old, dusty in places, but solid. Quiet. Too quiet, actually. The kind of silence that feels heavy, almost forced, like the house didn't want to be disturbed. Still, I was exhausted from moving and told myself I was just being paranoid. The first few nights were uneventful, but I kept waking up at 3:17 a.m., always the same time. No noise, no dreams, just an overwhelming sense of unease. I'd stare at the ceiling in the dark, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Then came the scratching. It started in the walls, soft at first, barely noticeable. I thought it was rats. I called pest control. They found nothing. The next night, it came again, louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard something breathing, slow, wet, alive. I began hearing footsteps upstairs, even though I lived alone and rarely went up there. Once, I found dirt, like something had walked barefoot through the upstairs hallway. I wiped it away. It came back every night, always leading to the same room, the attic. I never opened it. I didn't need to. Something about that door unsettled me deeply. I started dreaming about visions of the attic filled with rotten furniture, claw marks on the walls, and something watching from the corner. Something with eyes that didn't blink. I decided to leave, just pack my bags and go. But when I tried, the house fought back. My keys vanished. My car wouldn't start. My phone's GPS glitched, spinning in endless circles when I tried to get directions. The house didn't want me to leave. One night, while packing in a panic, I heard footsteps outside my room. Not cautious, but angry, rushing toward me. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and waited with my back pressed against it. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, my voice, calling my name. It whispered the same things I'd said earlier that day, word for word, but twisted, hollow, and wrong, like something had learned to mimic me. I didn't open the door that night. I just cried until the sun rose. Eventually, I managed to escape. I don't even remember how. I think I blacked out during the drive. When I came to, I was parked in a gas station miles away, shaking, cold, and completely disoriented. I never went back. I never even tried to get my things, but the house wasn't done with me. Everywhere I go now, I wake up at 3:17 a.m. No matter where I sleep, what time zone I'm in, it's always 3:17. Sometimes I hear the scratching in hotel walls. Sometimes I see footprints on my floor. And sometimes when I glance at mirrors or windows at night, I see the attic door behind me, slightly open, as if the house followed me, as if it never let me go. And deep down, I know something's waiting, just beyond the threshold of my mind, waiting for me to come back home